Welcome to It's Your Dime, a straight talk interview series presented by Shift Gold. I'm your host, Mike Maharrey. In this episode, I'll be talking to Professor Bill Greene. Bill is an assistant professor of political science at South Texas College. His claim to fame is casting a vote for Ron Paul as a member of the Electoral College. Bill is also an expert on constitutional tender. We start the interview talking about his experience in the Electoral College and the current movement to change the election process to a popular vote. We then shift gears and talk about the problems with fiat money, gold and silver as constitutional tender, how states can undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money, and a common objection to the gold standard. Thank you so much for listening to It's Your Dime. Today I am here with Bill Greene, and we're going to talk a little bit about constitutional tender, and we may talk about the Electoral College a little bit. How are you doing, Bill?
Well, I'm doing well. How's it going, Mike?
I'm doing fantastic. I appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk with the wonderful Shift Gold audience out there.
Hey, for you, anything.
I appreciate it. Well, okay, so the first question I've got for you, and this is my basic opening question, is who are you and why are you on my show? So just your opportunity to kind of give a little bit of your background and who you are and what you do.
Well, I am an assistant professor of political science and the assistant chair of the political science department at South Texas College down on the border in the Rio Grande Valley. And I teach government, I teach the Constitution, and I guess I'm on your show because of my work with constitutional tender and on the Federal Reserve.
Awesome. Yes, indeed. So, and the audience knows that I also work with the 10th Amendment Center, and I have worked together on kind of a state-based approach toward kind of attacking the Federal Reserve, the problems that we have there. So we'll get into that for just a second. But I want to talk a little bit first about probably you're best known for being the guy who voted for Ron Paul in the 2016 election, otherwise known as the Faithless Elector. So why did you do it?
Well, I did it because I could, basically. I mean, I've been teaching about the Electoral College for 25 years. And so I decided that after all the political activism and so forth that I've also been involved in over the years, I wanted to do something that I hadn't done before, but that I'd always wanted to do, which was go for trying to be an elector in this Electoral College that I had taught about for so often, since that's the people that actually do elect the president and vice president of the United States. So I got involved in the process and eventually was nominated in Texas to be an elector, and got to be an elector when Trump won the popular vote in the state of Texas. So when I got in there, I did what I had planned to do all along, which was vote the way that the founders and the framers of the Constitution had insisted that electors were supposed to vote, which was as a free agent.
Right.
The idea being, as Hamilton talked about in Federalist 68, that it's supposed to be people that are chosen within each state for their ability to take a look at who's out there and who, in their opinion, would be the best person in the United States to be the president of the United States. And so that's exactly what I did. I got in there and I took a look at who was available out there, and it was a pretty easy choice then.
No doubt.
To cast my vote for Ron Paul.
That's awesome. And a lot of people don't know there were actually, I believe, 10 faithless electors in that election, and the majority of them were actually supposed to vote for Hillary.
Yeah.
I just actually found that out the other day.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. I honestly thought that, I'll be one of those only, electors to do this sort of thing in the election, and that was fine. But then it turned out you had one other Republican elector that didn't vote for Trump, and then you had 5 Democratic electors that didn't vote for Hillary, and I think that threw everybody off. So it was one of the most interesting elections of our lifetime, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So were you censored at all in Texas? Do they require you to vote with the with your party, or I know some states that actually will fine faithless electors. Did anything like that happen to you?
No, in Texas, it's actually still, we're still allowed to vote for whoever we want to, and we can do write-in voting if we want. But in terms of what the response was after that, there was an immediate call for a law to bind electors in Texas, like about 29 other states, and they tried, and I went and testified against all the electoral binding bills because they would be unconstitutional, in my opinion. And so, we were actually able to stop that in the last session. And there's only been one bill introduced this session, and I think it's dead. I think Texas is still set, but it's eventually going to probably be settled in the Supreme Court. There's a couple of cases advancing, both from Colorado and Washington, where some of the other faithless electors were, and we'll see if that gets to the Supreme Court or not. I mean, I was in Texas. What they do have is you are required to sign a pledge in order to be nominated as an elector from your party. But of course, then once you get to the voting in the Electoral College itself, you have to actually take an oath. And the oath is not to your party or to your party's nominee. The oath is to the Constitution of Texas and the Constitution of the United States. So my oath to the Constitution actually superseded any party pledge that was ever made.
So what are your thoughts on the move that we're seeing to basically change the system so that it's a popular vote? I know that Colorado, their governor just signed a bill that requires all of the electors in that state to go to the candidate who gets the national popular vote. And I mean, if nothing else, I think it's pretty clear that it undermines the intent of the system. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a couple of things that are pretty obvious about it. Number one, it's an obvious just attempt to sort of go around the Electoral College, since they know that they can't get an actual constitutional amendment ratified to abolish the Electoral College, that it would never fly.
Right.
So instead, they're trying to get this through state by state to sort of through a compact, through an agreement among these states. To throw their Electoral College votes to whoever wins the most votes nationwide.
Right.
But I think that the other thing about that is it's an obvious ploy by Democrats just to try to win again.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they're so upset that they weren't able to win through the Electoral College that they want to get rid of that. But I think it's one of those things where they're not looking at the long-term consequences and how that could negatively affect themselves. I mean, if they were to actually get this done and we were to then have the next presidential election based on popular vote, I have no doubt that Donald Trump's campaign would simply shift its strategy and focus on winning enough in the popular vote, and they'd probably be able to do it, in which case all of these Democratic states would have to throw their Electoral College votes to the Republican. I think at that point they'd probably sue themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting that the assumption is that things would go along just as they have if you completely change the system. And I know Tom Woods has used the analogy before of the World Series. Mm-hmm. And if the object was to score as many runs as possible over 7 games, you would have a completely different strategy in pitching. As opposed to trying to win, 4 out of the 7 games. So, it's not like people would keep doing the same strategy when you change the way the game is played. It's kind of a dumb thing. But, I made the point. I recently did a talk on the Electoral College, and I made the point that what it really does fundamentally is it changes the way the system was intended to be set up, and the states were the preeminent political society in the American system. And when you change to a popular vote, then you create this singular national entity. And I would say, in effect, it's just like you alluded to, if if the folks in Colorado vote for candidate X and candidate Y wins the popular vote, then I would say that what you're doing is you're negating the will of the people of Colorado. And it really changes the way you look at the fundamental structure of the U.S. system. And
well, yeah, I mean, basically, it would be. I mean, I look at it. It would be one final nail in the coffin of federalism in this country, which really started with things like the 17th Amendment. Well, it goes even further back to the war between the states, but. But really, that's what they're attacking. And there's one more thing that just really bugs me about this whole thing, and that's that people keep thinking of Electoral College votes as just some big bucket of votes in each state that they can just throw at whatever candidate they want to. And that was certainly never the intent of the founders. It was supposed to be these are real people that are casting their real votes based on their deliberations and their understanding and their decisions. And what's happened since that time is people look at this as no, each state has this bucket of votes that they can then throw. Listen, when I was an elector in the Electoral College, I was not part of a bucket of votes. I was a real human being. And that's the thing. Now, most electors, of course, are always going to vote according to their party. I mean, that's how they get in there as electors. They're real party people. But that doesn't mean that you should bind them to that. They should still have that free agency that the Constitution and that the writers of the Constitution intended.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure that a lot of people realize that the popular vote was proposed and rejected during the ratifying convention, or not during the ratifying convention, but during the Philadelphia Convention, and there were good reasons for it. There were problems that the founders, in their wisdom, namely, I think it was Charles Pinckney from South Carolina made the point that in effect, with the popular vote, you're going to have the urban areas lording over the rest of the country. And if you look at the way the popular vote plays out, that would certainly still prove true today. So, there's a lot more involved in that. And I think most people just have this knee jerk, well, it's democracy, and they haven't really thought about the ramifications. But let's talk about sound money a little bit, because that's really why we're here. Although this is an interesting subject in and of itself, and certainly something that's in the news. But you wrote a paper, Ending the Federal Reserve from the Bottom Up, Reintroducing Competitive Currency by State Adherence to Article 1, Section 10. So a little more Constitution there. Before we really get into that and the strategy, though, let's back up and answer the more fundamental question. What's the problem with the fiat system that we have now? I mean, why should, normal Joe Blow who's just going to work every day, why should they care what kind of monetary system we have?
I think that the average person should care about it because it affects their money. I mean, it affects the value of their money, meaning that, the money that they have in their pocket from one day to the next can suddenly decrease in its purchasing power. Suddenly, it's today you're able to buy this much stuff with the dollars in your pocket, but tomorrow you're able to buy fewer things with those dollars, and next year it's even fewer things. And the reason for that is because there is this deliberate devaluing of fiat currency, because they have groups like the Federal Reserve and others, they have the ability to do that when they simply inflate the money supply, or when they fix the interest rates. What they're doing is they are manipulating the value of the currency in the average person's pocket. And it's beneficial when they do that. It's beneficial to the people at the top, the people that get the money first. But the average Joe, by the time this all trickles down to them, they once again find out that even though they've maybe gotten a raise a little bit or something, that suddenly they're still under the hammer. They're still having trouble making ends meet. They're still having to pay more and more money for all these things because of the resulting inflation. So the average Joe ought to be concerned about their money, and the fact that it's been turned all into fiat money, just creating money out of thin air, because the average Joe is having their money stolen from them through this process of inflation. Right.
You especially see it when you start thinking in terms of savings. If I take $10 and put it under my mattress, and in 20 years pull that $10 out, well, I don't have a whole lot in terms of purchasing power. And I think it's important to note that this is like you said, this policy is on purpose. You
Right.
you can listen to the folks at the Federal Reserve, and they're talking about we need to have this 2% inflation. That's part of their mandate, and which is really pretty absurd when you think about it. And you might think, well, 2%, well, that's not that big a deal. But then 2% every year over a 10-year span, then it starts to add up. So,
Or over 100-year span. Which
well,
is what
yeah, exactly. And what is it? Something like 95% of the value of the dollar is eroded away since the Federal Reserve was instituted in 1913.
Exactly. And I think the problem is that people don't have a long-term view of how this works. They think, oh, well, 2% a year, I can see that. But when you look at that long-term effect and the fact that our dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power, when I show this to my students in class, they get it. They see that, and they suddenly, the lights come on, and they're like, well, why are they doing this to our money? And we can talk about all the reasons that they say they're doing it for, but ultimately the end result is that our money loses its value, and it heads down that road towards what Voltaire talked about, which is that fiat money inevitably returns to its intrinsic value, which is
It's nothing. Exactly. I think an interesting way to illustrate the devaluation of money is to look at the minimum wage in silver quarters.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head. And of course, it fluctuates based on the price of silver. But basically, the minimum wage in the 1960s was 5 silver quarters.
Right.
And if you take the melt value, the silver, and at the time in 1964 and earlier, those quarters were made out of silver. If you take the melt value of the metal, you end up with about $15. So there's your $15 an hour minimum wage right there.
Yeah, and it's very true that it's not the minimum wage that needs to be fixed. It's our money.
It's the money, exactly. So we talk about we use this term constitutional tender. We use it over at the 10th Amendment Center and use that term as well. What does that mean? What is constitutional tender?
Well, I sort of came up with that phrase back in 2009 when I first started really looking into this part of Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, where it says that no state may make anything but gold or silver coin a tender in payment of debt. Right. So, when I teach federal government, I basically teach through the Constitution because that's sort of the foundation of federal
government. It's kind of novel.
Yeah. And so when I get to Article 1, Section 10, well, here I got to that point, and I was just explaining to them, because that's language that we don't use very much nowadays.
Right.
So I try to explain it to my students, and I say it simply means that states are not allowed to offer as an acceptable mode of payment, that is to make a tender, to offer as an acceptable mode of payment anything to pay off debts either owed by or to the state. They're not able to say this is acceptable to use for anything except gold or silver coins. And so, the idea of a tender, it means an offer. And right. So that's what this is very specific. It's a restriction on the states. They are not allowed to use any other form of money in any of their transactions except for gold or silver coins, or obviously, what represents gold or silver. Right. So as I explained that to my students, the students, they catch on to that then. Once you get the definitions down, they catch on. Mm-hmm. And so I had a student simply ask me, why, what's the deal with this then? Are states doing this? Do states use gold and silver? I'm like, well, no. He said, so how many do then? Well, none of them do. Well, then how are they able to do that? If the Constitution is very clear about this, did we pass an amendment to the Constitution that they don't have to use gold and silver anymore? Well, no, they just stopped doing that. And the reason that they stopped doing it was because the federal government rejected using gold and silver anymore. They took us off the gold standard. They took us off the silver standard. They moved completely to a floating fiat currency, and the states simply, automatically followed suit because they were using what was called legal tender money. They had to use it. So people just didn't notice. Well, now we're noticing because now we've got to this point where over 95% of our money's value has been lost. And I think people are starting to wake up to that fact, and they're realizing that it's because of the Federal Reserve and it's because of this fiat money system.
Absolutely. And I think, just to emphasize that point, the entire system really right now is unconstitutional because those
Right.
Federal Reserve notes.
That's why I wanted to call it constitutional
Yeah.
tender. I mean, everyone talks about legal tender, but legal tender, well, first of all, that's not even in the Constitution that,
Right.
that the federal government can do that. But in terms of constitutional tender, I wanted to emphasize that when we say the word tender in the Constitution, we're talking about an offer of payment. And so if we want to do this constitutionally, and I think the phrase was originally used by Daniel Webster, Senator Webster, where he said, the constitutional tender is the thing that must be preserved at all costs.
Right.
And what he understood was we need to not be moving into this fiat money realm where we're just creating money out of thin air and it's not backed by anything, that will result in hyperinflation, things that we've seen in the past. And so that's why I wanted to use this term of constitutional tender, because it is completely different than the unconstitutional form of tender, which is legal tender.
Right. So one of the great things that Ron Paul did was really bring attention to the Federal Reserve. I mean, I think he kind of, if he didn't coin the phrase, he at least popularized in the Fed.
Right.
And then, of course, the more moderate approach to that, audit the Fed, which we've seen some Rand and some others in Congress kind of still trying to carry that bucket. But it doesn't seem like anything realistically that's ever going to happen in Washington, D.C. I don't think there's much stomach for actually addressing the central bank. Yeah. You've got a different approach, which is a bottom-up approach, which you talk about in your paper, that you say can actually undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money. But what is that strategy? I mean, can you outline it in a kind of a nutshell? What can states actually do? I mean, we've got this big central bank. Can a state really do anything?
Sure. And the reason I talk about it being from the bottom up is because it really is a state level approach. You're absolutely right that the federal level approach it's too centralized, and it's also too easy pickings in terms of the supporters of the Federal Reserve and the Fed itself. I mean, the Federal Reserve has hired its own lobbyists to make sure that they don't even get audited.
Right.
And so approaching this from a federal level, I think is we have seen the results of it, and they just haven't been very positive. But in terms of going on a state-by-state approach, it's a much simpler thing to do, and the opposition then has to be very diffused and has to sort of be all over the place. The idea is that each state can simply take what is given to them in Article 1, Section 10, which is that requirement that they can only use gold and silver in their monetary exchange, gold and silver coins. And they can simply pass the affirming legislation on that, saying we can't use anything else. The Constitution doesn't allow us to use anything else. Therefore, we're not going to be using fiat money anymore. We're not going to be using Federal Reserve notes. If you have any kind of dealings with us, you are constitutionally required to use gold and silver coins. And if that occurs and the states start doing this constitutionally, doing it the correct way, then what you'll start seeing is people having to sort of move to using constitutional money. Not that they wouldn't be able to use Federal Reserve notes, they could still use those, just not in their dealings with the state.
Right.
But because they're having to deal with the state so much, which we all have to, there's going to have to be ways to start being able to use the constitutional forms of money. And those steps are already being taken. That pathway is already being laid through all sorts of things like gold and silver vaults that states like Texas are setting up, through companies that have Visa cards that are debit cards based on silver being in your account rather than fiat money.
Right. And
so as that begins to happen, and people start. It doesn't take long for people to realize that, okay, if I have silver in my account versus if I have fiat money in my account, from month to month and from year to year, I can see that my money that is based on silver is actually buying more things from year to year than the money that is based on nothing. And so It's a matter of getting that whole legal tender requirement sort of out of the way, which does this what we call Thier's law, which is sort of a reverse Gresham's law, which what that means is that the good money is going to be able to drive out the bad money because the federal government, isn't able to force people to use bad money anymore for all things. And I think that's the beginning of the end for the Federal Reserve, as people realize that their money is more valuable when it's not, based on thin air. Then the Federal Reserve notes are going to be used less and less, till eventually people are going to say, we don't really want this anymore, and it can go away.
Yeah. I think we're in an interesting time technologically too, because, even 10 years ago, people would say, well, we can't really do that because you can't carry around a bunch of gold and you can't, there was a physical limitation to that. And that's virtually disappeared with the advent of electronic transfers and electronic banking. I know there's
in fact, 10 years ago is exactly when we first introduced the Constitutional Tender Act in Georgia. And that was the argument that was being used. I don't want to carry around a bunch of gold and silver. And, we were trying to explain that, no, there's ways to do this electronically. Well, 10 years later now, it's 2019, and people don't carry money around to begin with. Everybody carries around their debit card,
exactly,
and so forth. And so, and we're at that point now where it is nothing to be able to simply swipe your card, and it's just the behind the scenes. Well, what is that card pulling from? Is it pulling from fiat money, or is it going to be pulling from? And I have a debit card where when I swipe that, the bank is in connection with a silver vault, and automatically it's pulling from the value of my silver rather than from the value of, or the lack of value of fiat money. And I can do that, and it's all done behind the scenes, and I don't notice the difference, but I do notice when the money that I do have in my account is actually retaining its value rather than losing its value.
Right, and I know there are at least two companies that do the same thing in gold. There's Gold Money, which is based out of Canada, and then United Precious Metals, I think it's UPMC, which is a Utah company, which interestingly, Utah is one state. Now, they didn't go so far as to say that we're only going to take gold and silver as legal tender, but they did take the step of officially making gold and silver legal tender in that state. And you've seen a company like UPMC come in and take advantage of that. So, even taking that first step, even if they don't go the whole way, and say we're not going to take Federal Reserve notes anymore, at least opening the door, because in a lot of states, it's not, gold and silver is treated like a commodity as opposed to as opposed to money. And
and these are beautiful first steps that states are starting to take now, where you're seeing states that are saying, look, these are coins, and in fact, they are legal tender coins, because even the federal government has said this silver coin is legal tender. This gold coin is legal tender. It's just that they put ridiculous face values on them.
$50 on a $1,300 coin.
So, but what the states are doing is starting to recognize, look, this is, we're going to recognize this as legal tender, but we're going to recognize it based on the actual value of the silver or the gold. And they're removing taxation on the exchange of those types of money. Those are just incredibly fantastic first steps. And now, as we're starting to see, first with Texas, and I think Utah is proposing it now, and other states are looking to follow suit, when you have these depositories that are state depositories, that you can, like here in Texas, I monthly deposit to my depository account. I put silver in there, and within the next year or two, they're going to be, it's going to be almost like a bank.
Yep.
You can just simply use it in that way. And again, I think these are great first steps, and in the end, I think it's the way to truly nullify the Federal Reserve Act from the state level.
Yeah, it's an approach that we've been supporting in from my putting on my 10th Amendment Center hat. We appreciate the work that you've done to kind of lay the philosophical groundwork, and there's some folks in Wyoming, in Arizona. They've taken a number of steps in terms of eliminating the taxation and whatnot. So, like you said, we're seeing those steps. So let me ask you this question. I was talking to a guy the other day, actually, and he's a local politician here, and we were meeting about some local issues. But he noticed that I have an "In the Fed" button on my book satchel. And he said, "Oh, in the Fed, he must be a Ron Paul fan, because like I said, people associate that." And he goes, "Yeah, I always liked some of Ron Paul's ideas, but he was a little kooky and out there on some of his economic ideas." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that? What specifically?" Trying to get a beat on where this guy was coming from. He said, "Well, this whole idea of a gold standard, that's just really not possible. There's not enough gold." Now, what would you say to somebody who would tell you? Because I said that's part of the point, that we don't want the government just to be able to expand the money supply at a whim, because really that's what's funding all of the wars and all of the out of control $22 trillion plus worth of spending. I mean, that's all made possible by mechanizations of the Federal Reserve. But his point was that if you had a gold standard, then gold would have to be like $10,000 an ounce, and that's just not practical. How would you address somebody that just has that kind of knee-jerk reaction when you start talking about using gold and silver as money?
Well, it's when I've been asked, is there enough gold or is there enough silver for us to be able to back the dollar with those? The answer is, of course there is, if it's truly a market-based system that we're talking about. If it's not the government saying that it's this much gold or silver per dollar, but if it's the market that's able to do that, then if it takes $10,000 to get that ounce of gold, then that's what gold is supposed to be worth.
Right.
That's the actual, the value, the purchasing power of gold. There is exactly enough gold and silver to meet demand if you allow the market to do its magic. It's so it's not a matter of now if the government is able to say, well, that gold, that 1 ounce gold coin is only worth $50. Then yeah, you're probably going to have trouble matching up the amount of gold to the amount of dollars that are available. But of course, you'd want to just remove that. And if the government had to be in there at all, it could be under the constitutional way, which is that the Congress can actually determine the value of the dollar in terms of what amount of silver can go into the dollar, for example.
Right.
And that's what the Constitution specifically says. Congress can do that, but not in terms of the purchasing power of the dollar. That's something that was supposed to be left up to the market.
Right. I think most people can't conceive of a system without the government. I mean, I almost feel like people believe that the government creates money.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that it's just a representation of value. It's a way of exchanging goods and services without having to actually, I don't have to hand you an apple in order to get an orange. We've created a way to facilitate exchanges. I don't think people look at that. I think that people look at money as kind of having a value in and of itself, and they don't recognize that it's really just a way of transferring actual things.
Yeah, and people, I think there's just been a real lack of education, economic education, civic education, and so forth in this country. And some of it's been deliberate so that they're able to continue to do these sort of things. But, it's hard accounting for. People like blood sausages. What are you going to do?
I don't. Well, that's a great discussion and a great overview. And if people are interested, I'm going to link to your paper on the show notes page, and I'll also link to some of the work that's going on over at the 10th Amendment Center in this area. And we've been reporting on some of the state bills as well on the Shift Gold website, which is shiftgold.com/news. I've got one more question for you. This is a key and very important question, which is really the determining factor on whether you will ever be able to come on the show again. So, typing, right?
Yeah.
When you type, do you put 2 spaces after the last word at the end of a sentence?
It depends on if I'm typing online or not. If I'm typing online, I know it doesn't matter because it's only going to give me 1 space. But if I'm typing a paper, for example, I can't break my old habit. I put 2 spaces after that period. Well,
okay, I'll give you 50%. This is my.
I'm old school.
This is my great pet. You probably took typing at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is my great
senior year of high school.
Yeah. This is my great pet peeve of editing, is when I have to go back and get rid of all of those spaces. Now, what you said, if you're not doing it online, then it really wouldn't be an issue for me. And a lot of people don't realize that there's a reason. The way the typewriter fonts are, you really need those extra spaces to make it readable.
Yep.
And the computer corrects for that. So when you're typing online, you don't really need to worry about it. But so as long as I don't have to edit it, I'm all right with it. So I guess we'll give you a pass on that.
All right.
So before we close out, are there any links or anything that you would like to give people if they want to follow what you're doing?
Well, definitely. They can go to the 10th Amendment Center and just click on the Sound Money links, because that's where I think the best information available today is on a lot of in terms of the activism that's happening in state after state. It does my heart good to continue to see it pushed forward by the 10th Amendment Center. I am in the process of actually writing a book called Nullify the Fed. That's all about the constitutional tender. My hope is to have that done within the year. We'll see.
That's exciting.
I want to get it done before it's too late.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'm with you there. All right. Well, that's outstanding. I really appreciate you taking the time. Appreciate all you do. It's nice to know that there's a professor out there that actually teaches the Constitution. I'm afraid that that's not something that happens a lot out there in the world of academia.
What's being taught is not exactly what the Constitution actually says, so that's unfortunate.
Mostly, you get constitutional law, which is what a bunch of politically connected lawyers have said over the last 250 years.
Exactly.
Which doesn't necessarily have any correlation with what the ratifiers and the drafters of the Constitution intended. So anyway, we appreciate the great work you're doing. And again, thank you for taking a time to be on the show.
Hey, y'all keep up the great work too. Thanks.
You've been watching It's Your Dime, an interview series presented by Shift Gold. For more information on investing in gold and silver, talk to a Shift Gold precious metal specialist today at 1-888-GOLD-160. That's 1-888-465-3160. Or visit us on the web at shiftgold.com. You can keep up with all of the latest precious metals news at shiftgold.com/news, and tune in each week to the Shift Gold Friday Gold Wrap podcast. This is your host, Mike Maharrey. I appreciate you watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.